Questions without notice, and I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. At Garma this weekend, will the Prime Minister tell participants that despite last year giving them, and I quote, a solemn promise to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full through Makarrata treaty-making and truth-telling, his position is now, as he told ABC Radio yesterday,
the Leader of the Opposition will pause. The Minister for the Environment, I've been crystal clear about hearing questions in silence. There will be no interjections. Out of respect, the Leader of the Opposition will begin his question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. At Garma this weekend, will the Prime Minister tell participants that despite last year giving them, and I quote, a solemn promise to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full through Makarrata treaty-making and truth-telling, his position is now, as he told ABC Radio yesterday, that he has no plans and sees no need for a national treaty? Is the Prime Minister's problem one of competency, or does he just say whatever he thinks people want to hear?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question, and I once again invite him to go to Garma, to actually talk with Indigenous Australians, to move away from his dirt unit and sit in the red dirt. They're in Arnhem Land, and there he can explain his position on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Because let's be very clear, both sides of Parliament are saying they support constitutional recognition. Both sides of Parliament are saying they support a legislated voice. The only difference between the two positions is that we are putting forward the position of constitutional recognition in the form that has been requested by Indigenous Australians themselves over a period of 2 decades. That will be what will be before the Australian people in the last quarter of this
Members
year.
on my left.
Because their commitment to legislate a voice completely undermines every argument that they make against it. Every argument. They clearly acknowledge it is needed, otherwise why would they legislate it? Clearly they recognise it will make a positive difference, otherwise why do they say legislate it? Clearly they don't see it as divisive or radical, otherwise why would they legislate it? This confected outrage by those opposite with regard to the Uluru Statement from the Heart is just that, confected, seeking political advantage by undermining the most disadvantaged group in Australia, who happen to be First Nations people, prepared to advance their political interests by undermining the interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And they know when it comes to treaty, David Crisafulli said this in the Queensland Parliament, the Leader of the Queensland LNP, I rise to support the Path to Treaty Bill 2023. Path to Treaty is a genuine opportunity for our state to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. Mr Speaker, I support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And the first part of Uluru Statement from the Heart is a voice, as requested, constitutionally enshrined, so that it can't be gotten rid of with the stroke of a pen.
Order. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and the House comes to order. I'd like to hear from the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Housing. How is the Albanese Labor government working in partnership with the states, territories and housing providers to help Australians find a safe and affordable place to call home, and what is blocking further progress?
Give the call to the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Homelessness and the Minister for Small Business. The member for Deakin.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Gilmore for her question, and I know that she understands the full scale of the challenges in housing that we inherited from the former government. The former government over there allowed the housing challenges to grow under their watch. They didn't do enough.
Order.
And the Albanese Labor government is trying to turn it around, Mr Speaker. We're elected with an ambitious housing agenda and we've added to it at every opportunity. Indeed, while those opposite blame the states and territories for the housing concerns, we have been working with them. Indeed, while they ignored the growing number of renters, we've acted. We've boosted Commonwealth rent assistance, we've incentivised build to rent, and indeed we're working with the states and territories on renters' rights. But whilst they turn their back on social housing in the states and territories, we're funding it. And we've recently done that with our $2 billion social housing accelerator, Mr Speaker. And indeed, the Minister for New South Wales said at the time it will help to immediately accelerate the delivery of more homes for the people of New South Wales. In the next 2 weeks, we'll receive this vital funding to help us rebuild our social housing system and support some of our most vulnerable, Mr Speaker. But whilst those opposite, they just can't seem to shake off the habits that they had when they did robo-debt, Mr Speaker. Indeed, their indifference is allowing Australians in need to stay on public housing waiting lists. But we are acting. And they should be listening, Mr Speaker. They should be listening to the thousands of Australians who are waiting for homes right across the country today. And if they did, they would not be standing in the way of the Housing Australia Future Fund bill. Indeed, if they had a heart, they would be listening to those struggling with housing. They would be listening carefully. They would not be voting against the thousands of new social and affordable rental homes. They're blocking homes for people that need them most when we want to build them, Mr Speaker. Blocking homes for people when we want to build them. And if they listen to the housing experts, to the sector, to those working on the front line, who all say we need the homes that this fund would build, they would not be blocking it. They need to listen to people like the ACT Shelter CEO, who today called for the fund to pass, who said there are projects right now in the ACT and in the other states that money could be financing or assisting to finance that are now on hold, Mr Speaker. And the Housing Industry Association, who said, and I quote, "The Housing Australia Future Fund bill does place important mechanisms to invest more in social housing, Mr Speaker, right across the board, whether it be the states and territories, whether it be the building sector, the construction sector, whether it be the community housing sector, or whether it be organisations supporting homeless people on the ground. They all want this bill to pass the House, Mr Speaker. They all want the funds to flow to get these homes on the ground. So I say to those opposite and to the Greens, get on board, let's build more homes.
The call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Yesterday, when the Prime Minister was asked whether he supported treaty, he said, and I quote, "That's like asking if you support the sun coming up," end quote. Does the Minister for Indigenous Australians support a treaty with financial compensation paid by the Commonwealth?
Order. Members on my right. The Minister for the Environment. Order. The Minister for the Climate Change and Energy and the Minister for Skills. Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Minister for the Indigenous Australians has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Farrer for her question. I have been asked again by the member for Farrer about the elements of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And the Australian government supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart. You're aware of that. And the Uluru Statement has 3 elements. The first request is for a voice to Parliament, which is what the referendum will be about later this year. And then it refers to Makarrata for truth-telling and agreement-making. As I have said, progress on Makarrata will not occur until after the referendum. Our priority is constitutional recognition through a voice. Our priority is recognition, listening and getting better results. The Prime Minister has issued an invitation to the Leader of the Opposition to come to Gama this weekend. And I now issue an invitation to you, Deputy Leader, to come to Gama this weekend. And not only
Order.
Listen.
And
Order. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition has asked a question. Members on my right will cease rejecting the Minister in continuation.
Come and listen.
not only am I inviting the Deputy Leader
Order.
to come to Garma, I'll even make sure there's some bug spray available for you.
Order. Members on my left and right. The member for Lingiari. Order. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Social Services. How will the passage of the Strengthening the Safety Net Bill help to deliver the Albanese Labor Government's $14.6 billion cost of living package? And what has been the response to the government's support for those Australians who need it the most?
Call to the Minister for Social Services.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Adelaide for that question. Of course, yesterday the government's plan to strengthen the safety net has passed the parliament, and our plan will deliver cost of living support for around 800,000 people on JobSeeker, 230,000 people on youth allowance, 1.1 million households who receive rent assistance, and more support for 57,000 single parents. Now, these were well-calibrated, responsible changes that provided support without adding to inflation. Now, of course, with the passage of our safety net bill yesterday, additional support and help to those doing it toughest will flow from the 20th of September. Now, this was widely welcomed across the spectrum, with Australian Council for Social Services, who called this bill a step in the right direction after years of decline and neglect. Now, of course, you don't need to think too far about where these years of decline and neglect happened. It was under those opposite. And this was, of course, further demonstrated by the mean-spirited amendment yesterday to the bill that scrapped the $40 increase for JobSeeker, which, if that amendment was successful, would have denied much-needed relief to so many Australians, around 1 million Australians. Now, of course, yesterday Senator Ruston sang from the same old Liberal song sheet during the debate, saying that this increase to working payments would only incentivise welfare. Of course, we don't have to think too far back to her also infamous comments in 2019, where she said increases to unemployment benefits would end up giving drug dealers and pubs more money. That is the attitude of those opposite. Of course, it's hardly surprising that they're also those opposite the party of robo-debt. Now, Commissioner Holmes, when talking about the robo-debt scheme, said it was remarkable how little thought it was given to how it would impact welfare recipients. The Liberal Party robo-debt scheme caused suffering to more than 430,000 people.
Pause. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, the question was about the passage of the Safety Net Bill, and it finished with what's been the response. On any view, the territory the Minister is now canvassing is not relevant to the question.
I'm just going to ask the Minister to make her answer relevant to the question. She's straying into another territory that wasn't part of the question. I must bring her back to the question.
Well, Speaker, what I am highlighting is the connection between the cruel approach of those opposite when it came to robo-debt and their cruel approach to trying to oppose a $40 increase. Of course, the Leader of the Opposition claimed with our safety net bill it would just make it more attractive to stay in unemployment. Those opposite just don't get it. Well, the Albanese Labor government is getting on with the job of delivering more support to those Australians who rely on our social safety net. Labor built a strong social safety net, and I'm proud that this bill will further strengthen it.
Yeah. Give the call to the honourable member for Kennedy.
Environment Minister, the latest Spectator cover page, Cholumba and the new Franklin Dam, details Queensland's in-principle approval of 86 wind turbines, each 308 foot high. Minister, won't it destroy 3,000 acres of periphery jungle, kill bird life, cost taxpayers a fortune, generate minuscule electricity, and its working life's only 19 years? Whilst applauding your break on Chulumban, Minister, wouldn't you agree with Environment Professor Navard? Chulumban transforms 200 kilometres of nature wonderland into an industrial wasteland.
The member's time has expired. Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Kennedy for his question today. He has spoken to me on many occasions about the Chulumban wind farm, and I know that his interest in the local environment there is absolutely sincere. He's referred to an article in The Spectator. He did me the courtesy of sending it around just before question time. That's an article that criticises investment in the wind farm in favour of nuclear power. We're not a party that believes that nuclear power is great for the environment, but going to the individual individual instance of the Chulumban wind farm that he has raised, as I've said to him before, given that this is currently before me as a decision maker, I'm not able to comment.
The Minister can, if you completed your answer.
No, I thought you were drawing them.
No, I was saying the Minister and the member for Fairfax can cease their interjections. My apologies.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr Speaker. I thought you were asking me to take a seat while you quietened them down. Mr Speaker,
Order.
I want to say to the member for Kennedy, as I have said to him before, I can't comment on individual projects. I make these two general sets of comments. Queensland can absolutely
Leader of the
be
Opposition.
a censor.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition knows that is inappropriate, will cease interjecting or will be warned.
How's your pre-selection going?
Order. The Minister will return to the question.
Thank you. Two general things that I can say to the member for Kennedy. The first is that Queensland can be a renewable energy superpower. We know that Queensland is perfectly placed for investment in solar, in wind, in hydro, indeed. It's great for renewable energy and the jobs that come with renewable energy that the Treasurer is so concerned about. However, we know that this investment has to meet our environmental objectives as well. Climate change, huge threat to the environment, but we know that individual projects also need to meet the environmental standards that we expect from these large developments, because we know that, of course, these sorts of large developments can have significant impacts. Can I reassure the member for Kennedy about one issue he's also raised with me in the past when it comes to renewable energy? He has talked to me about the impact of solar panels and other household renewable energy products. We have just held a consultation on recycling for solar panels, for small electric goods as well, because we know that our renewable energy future comes with it a responsibility to environmental issues today.
Order. The Minister for Infrastructure and the member for New England will cease their conversation across the chamber as well. Before I call the member for Boothby, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is a group of sixth form exchange students from Chabert College in Devonshire, England, as guest the Manager of Opposition Business. A warm welcome to you all. I give the call to the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Workplace Relations. What steps has the Albanese Labor government taken to get wages moving after a decade of wage stagnation?
Give the call to the Minister for Employment, Industrial Relations and the Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Boothby for the question, someone with a real commitment to getting wages moving in this country. Because for 10 years, low wages were a deliberate design feature of the previous government and their management of the economy. And it was one of the few commitments they managed to deliver on. The pace of wage growth under the previous government at 2.1%
the member for
wasn't
KC.
just slower than the decade before or slower than the decade before that. It was the slowest pace of wage growth since the Second World War, and it was delivered quite deliberately by those opposite. What do we have now? We now, instead of the 2.1% that averaged over their decade, wages are now at 3.7%. But if you're on an award, the latest increase, 5.75%. But if you're on the minimum wage, the latest increase, 8.6%. And if you work in the aged care sector, on top of those increases, a further 15% improvement in your wages. The party of Robodebt didn't just go after people on welfare. They went after people on wages as well. And they succeeded. And they succeeded. All these workers that I described are now getting more in their bank accounts for one simple reason, and that is because the government has changed. They refused, those opposite refused to turn up at the Fair Work Commission and argue for an improvement at the minimum wage. They refused to turn up at the Fair Work Commission and argue for an improvement in award wages. They refused to turn up at the Fair Work Commission and argue for an improvement in the wages of aged care workers. All of this was part of the wage stagnation story of that decade. But then in opposition, they've continued, because part of getting wages moving is to close the gender pay gap. And yet, when we introduced stronger gender equity laws, they opposed them. When we introduced access to flexible work, they opposed it. When we had legislation to ban pay secrecy clauses, they opposed it. When we had a law put to the parliament to ban job ads from being below the legal minimum. Now think about that. That one might have been not so controversial. A job ad should be banned if it's advertising a wage rate that is illegal, but even that was too far a step for them. Even that was too much, and they had to oppose that as well. Sunsetting zombie agreements where people are on pay and conditions from the Howard Work Choices era. They had to oppose that as well. And having workable bargaining rules. Well, there's more tests to come in your commitment as to whether you care about people getting more pay when we look later this year at closing the loopholes that undercut wages.
Give a call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. In October, the Treasurer provided $5.8 million for an independent Makarrata Commission for national treaty making. $900,000 has already been spent. Can the Treasurer inform the House what this has delivered?
Order. Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, unlike the Shadow Treasurer, I believe there's an important role for the federal government and the federal budget in seeking and delivering better outcomes for First Nations people. And I stand by the funding that we've provided over 2 budgets now towards that objective. Now, as I said earlier in the week, Mr Speaker, one of the reasons why the Shadow Treasurer and his colleagues over there don't want to ask us about what this referendum is about is because they know they don't want to ask us what it's about. They want to ask it what it's not about.
On my left.
This referendum is not about Makarrata. This referendum is not about the other issues that they are asking about. This referendum is about a voice to Parliament, Mr Speaker. And a voice to Parliament is about recognition and listening and better outcomes, and I'm surprised he doesn't want to see those better outcomes, Mr Speaker.
Treasurer will pause. On the member for Moreton, not 2 days in a row. The member for Hume on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, this was a very specific and very polite question. What has the $900,000 allocated for making treaties delivered?
The question was about the Makarrata Commission for the treaty making and money allocations. I'm just going to bring the Treasurer back to that part of the question.
Mr Speaker, the money in the budget in October, the money in the budget in May, the money in future budgets towards getting better outcomes for First Nations people is all about trying to close the gap in outcomes. And one of the reasons, once again, Mr Speaker, that they want to ask us these sorts of questions is because they can't argue against the fundamental reason for a voice to parliament, and that's better
Member
outcomes
Hume
for people.
will cease interjecting.
It's about recognition and listening and better outcomes. And I think it's disappointing but not especially surprising, Mr Speaker, to hear that the guy who wants to be the Treasurer of this country is not interested in better outcomes for our First Nations brothers and sisters. That's what the referendum is about, and that's what the funding in the budget is about.
Order. The member for Groom does not need to continue and interject after a minister has taken their seat. I want to hear from the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government providing cost of living relief for Australians in need? And what are the obstacles to this being delivered?
Call to the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, it's an honour to serve with the member for Hunter, and I thank him for his question. Inflation's easing in our economy in welcome ways, but we know that Australians are still under substantial pressure. More jobs have been created in our first year than under any other new government, but we know that there's a lot of global economic uncertainty, and that, combined with higher interest rates, is slowing our economy here at home. And we saw that in the retail figures out today, which were very soft. Now, in this environment, Mr Speaker, the government's #1 priority is rolling out billions of dollars of help with the cost of living. And that assistance is being delivered in ways that addresses the most pressing parts of our inflation challenge and in targeted ways that makes the job of the Independent Reserve Bank easier, not harder. Now, we're doing that at the same time as we're delivering the first budget surplus in 15 years and investing in supply-side issues which were ignored for a wasted decade. Now, Mr Speaker, you would think that those people in this place who come in here and ask questions about people doing it tough would actually put their hand up to help people who are doing it tough. But sadly, Mr Speaker, that hasn't been the case, and I want to give the House a few examples. When 5 million Australians needed them to vote for some help with their electricity bills, they voted for even higher electricity bills instead. When Australians needed them to vote for price caps on gas and coal, they voted for even higher energy prices instead. When vulnerable and homeless people needed them to vote for more social and affordable housing, they voted for fewer homes instead. When 6 million Australians with chronic conditions need cheaper medicines, those opposite say they'll vote for medicines to be more expensive instead. And as the minister said a moment ago, when the workers of Middle Australia needed us to get wages moving again, those opposite voted for even more wage stagnation in our economy. The Shadow Minister the other day, Mr Speaker, even said they'd block an increase to working age income support payments until the opposition leader humiliated him a few hours later. Mr Speaker, my point is this. At every turn they vote to make things worse. They've got a lot of nerve, Mr Speaker. If they cared about the cost of living, they would vote to help people with their cost of living. This opposition leader wants the voice to go down and prices to go up, and for the same cynical, political, negative reasons. He's more interested in driving a wedge between Australians than driving down inflation in our economy.
Take a seat for a moment so I can hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
On relevance, the question was about how the government's delivering cost of living relief and what are the obstacles to this being delivered. And this Treasurer has been straying to areas that are well outside the terms of that. He is a serial offender.
All right. Order. Members on my right. The Treasurer is outlining obstacles. I'll just make sure the obstacles are related to the question, and he has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Those opposite would rather fight Labor than fight inflation. Inflation is moderating, but the Liberals and Nationals aren't. The party of Robo-Debt has learnt nothing from a decade of failure, and that stench will remain even after the member for Cook leaves us.
Before I call the member for Lyne, there's now a general warning issued. I'm looking particularly at the member for Deakin and Barker. So that means no more interjections, or you will leave the chamber. I hope that's clear. Give the call to the honourable member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. Will the minister commit to publicly releasing details of the proposed federal cultural heritage reforms prior to the referendum on the Voice to Parliament?
Order. The Minister for Immigration will cease interjecting. I give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you so much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. He's asking a question about two completely unrelated things. He's asking a question about the referendum, and the referendum, of course, is very clear. It's about a constitutional amendment to recognise 65,000 years of history and culture in this country. And it's about listening. It's about recognition and it's about listening. Now, the cultural heritage reforms that were begun under the previous Environment Minister, the work that was commissioned under her, the funding contracts that were entered into under her, that work is ongoing. That work is ongoing. It is complex work, and in fact, I've been delighted that until now this work has been supported in a bipartisan way, not just by the former Environment Minister, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, not just by the member for Leichhardt, as I have repeatedly said in the excellent work that he did with Senator Dodson on the Duke and Gorge inquiries, but also by your Shadow Minister for the Environment, who in the other place on the 28th of November last year said those events were so disastrous that they made it very clear that comprehensive work needed to begin as a matter of urgency on modernising Indigenous heritage protection laws in Australia. Comprehensive work. We are doing that comprehensive work in the way that was begun by the previous Minister for the Environment. And indeed, the member for Cowper has said, when responding to the Duke and Gorge reports, and I quote, "We are very pleased that the Minister has now made clear that she will be continuing the work that had already begun in this area during the years of the coalition government." And further, I quote, "We always considered that it was vital that this process be centred on the views and the experience of traditional owners." That's why we are engaging in this detailed way, this thoughtful way, with the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance, the organisation contracted by the previous Minister for the Environment. Can I also say that Senator Dean Smith said
the Minister will pause and I'll hear from the member for Lyne.
I'm just asking the answer to be relevant to the question.
So far the Minister has covered the issue of cultural heritage reforms and linking it to the referendum on the Voice, so I don't know. I'm listening carefully to what she's saying. I'll make sure she remains relevant.
Yeah, the fact that you don't like the answer doesn't make it irrelevant. Senator Dean Smith, Mr Speaker, said in relation to the Duke inquiry in October last year, 18 months after the destruction of the Duke and Gorge, which we know to be of such tremendous heritage value to Indigenous people in my home state of Western Australia, people should ask themselves what has changed, supporting this work that we need to do on heritage.
The call to the member for Jagga Jagga.
My question is to the member for Bruce, as chair of the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit. With reference to the committee's inquiry into Synergy 360 linked procurement at Services Australia and the NDIA, how and when was the inquiry initiated? What has been the process to date? What hearings have been scheduled and with whom? What are the next steps? Can people still make submissions? What are the process impediments to completing the inquiry, and when will a report be tabled?
In his capacity as chair of the Joint Committee, I give the call to member for Bruce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Jagga Jagga. I'll address her questions about the inquiry's process and procedure. With regard to the inquiry's initiation, evidence was received at public hearings on the 14th of April into the inquiry into Commonwealth procurement, from Dr Ian Wadacey, the former Secretary of the Departments of Prime Minister and Cabinet and Finance, the Chief Executives of Services Australia and the NDIA, and Synergy 360 principals, including Stuart Roberts Associates, Mr David Milo and Mr John Margerrison. Procedurally, as Dr Watt was not able to examine the actions of ministers, lobbyists and vendors, the committee utilised its powers to initiate this inquiry focused on Synergy 360-related procurements, given the seriousness of the evidence regarding irregularities. The committee has held both public and in-camera hearings, including with Mr Groth, Infosys Vice President, and an unnamed witness at an in-camera hearing last Friday, the 28th of July, at Witness A. The committee's progress has been seriously impeded due to the key witness, Mr Margerrison, failing to answer questions. Therefore, on the 27th of June, the committee took a very rare step, Mr Speaker, resolving to order Mr Margerrison to produce all documents requested and fully respond to all questions and appear at a hearing last Friday, the 28th of July. Unfortunately, Friday's hearing did not proceed, as Mr Margerrison's lawyer informed us that Mr Margerrison is now resident overseas, having severed all ties with the country of Australia many weeks ago. The committee's work is delayed as Mr Margerrison's whereabouts, Mr Speaker, are unknown, and he considers himself outside the jurisdiction of this parliament. At its private meeting this morning, the committee considered this turn of events and resolved to write to his lawyer seeking advice as to Mr Margerrison's whereabouts. Now, of course, it remains within the JCPAA's power to recommend referrals to other investigative bodies with the additional resources and powers which we may not possess. The committee will also shortly publish new information from Infosys, following evidence that Infosys paid Synergy 360 in the order of $16 million, including success fees, and held 11 meetings with former Minister Stuart Robert, sometimes without public servants present. The committee has reached no conclusions at this stage, and anyone with information is encouraged to contact the committee and is welcome to make a submission. And further hearings may be held in August and September, but I cannot advise the House when a report will be tabled. And finally, Mr Speaker, in the interest of transparency, the committee has also issued a public reminder that witnesses before committees are protected with respect to evidence by the law of parliamentary privilege, and that interfering with or harassing witnesses in any way may be regarded as a contempt of the parliament.
Give the call to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. Members on my right.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House 1 notes that the Prime Minister is dividing the nation with his divisive voice proposal by deliberately refusing to provide detail to the Australian people. 2 notes that the Prime Minister promised on 34 occasions to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, which includes the Makarrata Commission's national treaty-making process, but has since continually denied that there will be a treaty. 3 notes that the Minister for Indigenous Australians said work on a treaty was to start within weeks, but the Prime Minister is now walking that back. In 2 train-wreck media interviews, the Prime Minister is telling different audiences different things on the treaty. 4 notes that despite the Prime Minister being shifty on whether a treaty is being worked on, he's already allocated $5.8 million for the Makarrata Commission national treaty-making process, but refuses to explain how $900,000 of this money has already been spent. 5 notes that the government's Minister for Indigenous Australians has treated this House with absolute contempt by repeatedly and consistently failing to answer direct questions in question time, and 6 condemns the Prime Minister for his complete inability to be upfront and honest with the Australian people, and calls on the Prime Minister to explain today in plain language, A, what the voice will be,
members on my right.
how it will be structured and how it will operate, B, what the Makarrata Commission will be, how it will be structured and how it will operate, C, what the money for the Makarrata Commission is being spent on, and D, what the treaty-making process will be, how long it will take, and what the financial implications for the Commonwealth and for taxpayers will be.
Is leave granted?
Leave's not granted, but if you move to suspension, we're not going to shut you down.
Order. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I move that so much of the standing orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion. That the House, 1, notes that this Prime Minister is dividing the nation with his divisive voice proposal by deliberately refusing to provide detail to the Australian people. 2, notes that the Prime Minister promised on 34 occasions to implement the Uluru Statement from the heart in full, which includes the Makarrata Commission's national treaty-making process, but has since continually denied that there will be a treaty. 3, notes that the Minister for Indigenous Australians said work on a treaty was to start within weeks, but the Prime Minister is now walking that back. In 2 train wreck media interviews, the Prime Minister is telling different audiences different things on the treaty. 4, notes that despite the Prime Minister being shifty on whether a treaty is being worked on, he's already allocated $5.8 million for the Makarrata Commission national treaty-making process, but refuses to explain how $900,000 of the money has already been spent. 5, notes that the government's Minister for Indigenous Australians has treated this House with contempt by repeatedly and consistently failing to directly answer questions in question time, and 6, condemns the Prime Minister for his complete inability to be upfront and honest with the Australian people, and calls on the Prime Minister to explain today in plain language, A, what the voice will be, how it will be structured and how it will operate, B, what the Makarrata Commission will be, how it will be structured and how it will operate, C, what the money for the Makarrata Commission is being spent on, and D, what the treaty-making process will be, how long it will take and what the financial implications for the Commonwealth and for taxpayers will be. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that this Prime Minister stood up at Garma and said to the Australian people with great passion, with much emotion, that he proposed words that hadn't been consulted on, that hadn't been properly researched, ultimately that were against advice by the government, Mr Speaker, by the government solicitor who had advised against the breadth of words that now are being proposed by way of referendum to the Australian people. Now, Mr Speaker, every Australian wants a better outcome for Indigenous Australians. Every Australian wants to see a better outcome in Alice Springs. Mr Speaker, every Australian wants to see a better outcome for children in terms of school attendance, in terms of health outcomes, of life expectancy. We want to see better housing options. But, Mr Speaker, the Voice is not going to deliver that practical support on the ground because it is a Canberra voice and a voice for the elite of this country. Why, Mr Speaker, can you ask yourself this, why, on the current information available to us, why do we have a situation where 29% of Labor voters in this country are not supporting the Voice? Now, if the Prime Minister had any coherent explanation to the Australian public as to how the Voice will work, what outcomes it will deliver, the breadth, what the interpretation will be in the High Court, how it will change our system of government, then perhaps there would be some chance of convincing those 29% of Labor voters. But the Prime Minister is deliberately and willingly withholding that information from Labor voters and from the Australian public. And that is why, Mr Speaker, this situation goes from bad to worse, because the Australian Prime Minister is seeking to divide his nation. That's what's happening here, Mr Speaker. The best-case scenario on this incompetent Prime Minister's approach to the Voice is that you might get a 51-49 yes outcome, bearing in mind that you need a double majority.
Members on
that
my right.
splits our country straight down the middle. Straight down the middle. Now, no Prime Minister in good conscience would decide over such a process unless he was seeking political advantage or unless he was out of his depth. Now, Australian families at the moment are paying more for their electricity bills. They're paying more at the grocery checkout. They're paying more for their insurance. They're paying more for their mortgages because of this incompetent government. The incompetence is not just demonstrated in terms of the Prime Minister's management around the Voice. It is every aspect of government delivery at the moment. That's what the Australian public is experiencing. And, Mr Speaker, I'll tell you that when you walk the streets, when you talk to people across the country, that is why they are saying they are not better off today than when Labor was elected. The Australian public knows that this Prime Minister is taking us down a cul-de-sac. This Prime Minister is dividing the country unnecessarily because there is a bipartisan position in this country at the moment that would see a question on recognition in the Constitution for our first occupants of this country. It would receive 80% support across the nation. It can be put to the people in October of this year. It wouldn't divide, but it would unite the country. And yet our Prime Minister knowingly rejects that proposition. Why? I mean, why would he reject a proposition to unite our country? Why would he cast that aside and instead go down the path of pitching one Australian against the other? Why would it be, Mr Speaker, that 1 in 3 Labor voters has called this Prime Minister out as a fake and phony? We know this Prime Minister, Mr Speaker. We know more and more about him every day. His great idol, Kevin Rudd, we see more of Kevin Rudd in this Prime Minister as every day goes by. We knew of Kevin Rudd that he started out, but he was somebody very different than what the public believed him to be. This Prime Minister will say one thing to one audience and tell the next audience what they want to hear. But the problem is, Mr Speaker, that people match up what he's saying. So when you turn up to a midnight oil concert and you're wearing a T-shirt that says that you're in favour of yes and you're in favour of treaty and you're in favour of truth-telling, you know what that says? It doesn't say, as the Prime Minister wants us to believe, that he turned up not adequately attired for a midnight oil concert, and that somehow, in a snap moment of choice, he finds himself clothed in a midnight oil T-shirt. It's sort of like a Deirdre Chambers moment. It does have a ring of that to it. I mean, how did this T-shirt find itself on my body? That's what he's arguing, and it shows you how insincere this man is. Prime Minister, you have the opportunity to unite the Australian people. You have the opportunity to cut through the waste that is taking place in the money that's administered to help Indigenous Australians. You have the opportunity to work with us to make sure that we listen to Indigenous Australians and get the outcomes that they deserve. But you are not going to do it through a treaty process that you have embarrassingly walked away from. And talked in a duplicitous way to the Australian public on this topic. A Makarrata Commission that's been funded but is operating in secrecy, that you will not speak anything about. The Prime Minister has the opportunity to step up and to unite the Australian public. He is not doing that. And when a Prime Minister makes a deliberate decision to harm our national interest, I'll tell you who is watching: the entire Australian public, because they are disappointed in this Prime Minister. He has the chance to do good and he's choosing not to do so. And when he goes up to Garma, he can be sincere, Mr Speaker. He can be sincere this time because at the last Garma conference he provided the detail of the words, but no detail every day since that point. And that's the problem here. The problem is not with the Australian public, as those opposite want us to believe. The Australian public's not hard-hearted. People aren't saying that they're voting no because they don't want to support Indigenous Australians. They will vote no because they know this Prime Minister is wilfully withholding detail from them. And that is unconscionable. And it's something the Prime Minister should apologise for. It's something that he should be upfront with the Australian public so that they can be properly informed when they cast their vote. But every day, and bearing in mind we're less than 3 months from this referendum vote, the Prime Minister makes a decision not to look Australians in the eye and answer the questions that they appropriately are putting to him. And when an Australian Prime Minister breaks that trust with the Australian people that voted for him only 15 months ago, they've worked out that this bloke is a phony and a fraud and is running an incompetent government.
Is the motion seconded?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I second the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I second the motion moved by the Leader of Opposition. And I second the motion because this Prime Minister and this government has taken our nation to a pivotal moment in its history. And while that's their prerogative, the onus of their responsibility is to lead our country and to build trust with honesty and transparency about the proposition that they propose for the Australian people to make, an important decision about their constitution, one in which they should be brought along that journey every step of the way. The Uluru Statement of the Heart is one about voice, truth and treaty. That journey should be explained in entirety, not in part. This is an important moment for our nation's history, for our nation to make a determination, and the proper procedures and processes should be taken from the outset. And because the Prime Minister has failed to trust the Australian people, to bring the Australian people on this journey with him, we have seen the erosion of support for this first element, the voice, from over 60% in December last year to now less than 50% today. That's a direct result of a government failing to create an environment for the Australian people to have faith and have trust in their government, in the proposition that they put before them. They failed to create an environment where they went through due process of a constitutional convention. Australians were denied due process of a constitutional convention, instead deferring to the Uluru Statement of the Heart, where only one cohort of Australians got to make a determination about our constitutional future. That's not leadership. That's not about bringing the Australian people on a journey. That is creating division. That erodes the opportunity for every Australian to have a say in their document, a document that is important to them, that governs them and defines our nation into the future. And they've actually misled the Australian people in saying that the voice is a new concept. It's not. We are repeating the mistakes of the past. We've had a representative body before. It was called ATSIC. And it's for that premise that the National Party some 9 months ago made a principled position that we cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. We're not doing something new. And because we represent the people where the disadvantage is the most, where we bear the scars, of the mistakes of the past and the ones that we will repeat again.
For Climate Change
we
and
need
Energy.
an intervention in 2023. That intervention needs to be in bureaucracy. It needs to be about reshaping the bureaucracy and empowering local elders in local communities. Not regionally, but in a local community. Empowering those local elders, because we are repeating the mistakes of the past that will not shift the dial. We have the data, we have the understanding of where the gap needs to be closed, and this is about making sure Canberra goes to them, not them come to Canberra. Allowing bureaucracy to repeat the mistakes of generalising the feedback into national programs. You need local programs to close the gap. You need to be able to understand what they are in bespoke models in bespoke communities. Instead, this is a government top operation saying to the people out there that we know best, instead of empowering those local elders. This isn't about tangible outcomes. Because if this was about what we all want, about constitutional recognition, we made it clear. We've made it very clear that if we didn't conflate the two, if we wanted to unify our nation, in a meaningful way, to take that opportunity, to take that hand, both sides of the aisle, a moment of leadership, a moment of political leadership, where this nation could actually achieve what the Prime Minister has set out in constitutional recognition, that would be a unifying moment. But it has been lost, not just on how this voice has been devised, but the processes that flow beyond it, about the processes of treaty and the consequences and the reach of that, so that Australians understand If the Prime Minister wants Australians to come on this journey with him, he should be prepared to put the legislation not only for the voice in the parliament, to demonstrate he runs the business in this parliament. He could be open and transparent to the Australian people about what it is, but he should also be open and transparent to the Australian people about what a treaty is, how far-reaching it is and what it means for every Australian. This could be a unifying moment, but unfortunately this Prime Minister has missed it.
The question is the motion be agreed to, and I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, in the lead-up to this parliamentary sitting week, we were told that it was going to be about cost of living. But they've given up on cost of living and they've decided to stick with dividing. They've decided to stick with,
the member for Fairfax.
stick with division from someone who we thought could not be more divisive than the former Prime Minister that he replaced as leader of the Liberal Party, but of course the leader of the opposition is managing it. The same person who, when, as he mentioned, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister, when he stood at this dispatch box and gave the apology to stolen generations, it was a proud moment to be in this parliament. And the then leader of the Liberal Party, Brendan Nelson, had the courage of his conviction to do the right thing and to stand at this dispatch box as well and make sure that that was a matter of national unity. And around the country, school children gathered in front of television screens to celebrate that moment to advance reconciliation, that moment to lift up our nation. And the Leader of the Opposition not only opposed it, threatened to resign from the front bench over it and walked out on that event. So terrible was it that in that moment of national unity there were only a few people who were so determined to sow division that they just couldn't cop the concept of saying sorry for the wrong thing being done, for children being stolen from mothers, fathers and grandparents, families and communities. Could not stomach it. Could not stomach it. Now we have heard, from the Leader of the Opposition a range of comments, most of which was not about what is before the Australian people. He spoke about my speech to Garma last year, and I'm proud of it. And I'll be proud of the speech that I give at Garma this weekend. Now, there was a time where the leaders of both countries went to Garma, and today both parties and those opposite now have a situation whereby not a single front bench member from the coalition is attending this event. And today, on his weekly tough interrogation by Ray Hadley on 2GB, he went on to say that he wasn't going to attend because it was all about a left fest. Well, the Yotta Yindi Foundation that hosts that event, the Leader of the Opposition was happy to go to the funeral of Yunupingu and to state the important work that great Australian, his contribution to this nation.
The member for Deakin will leave the chamber under 94A.
And Mr Speaker, today also in that interview, he said that the reason why he said this, I want to see constitutional recognition, want to see that, but as Ray Hadley said, if this gets beaten, it won't be revisited in my lifetime. The response of the Leader of the Opposition was to say that the referendum will change the whole system of government, that it will cost billions of dollars, that it will change the whole system. And we heard that again today. Well, I say this to those opposite. You can't say that it will change the entire system of government and then say you will legislate the voice, because that is what you are saying. You can't say it will promote racial division and then say you will legislate for the voice. You can't say it will make a positive difference, but then say you will legislate for the voice. Because clearly they don't see it as radical or divisive or any of the other noise of confusion that they are seeking to inject into the referendum. Otherwise, why would they legislate it? So let's be very clear. Both sides say that they support constitutional recognition. Both sides say that they support legislating for the voice. And under the provision, the third provision that is being put forward, it makes it very clear. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. And and they ask, where's that legislation? They actually had 9 years. This process, to be very clear, when the leader of the National Party actually spoke about process. They opposed it before they even knew what the question was. And then the Liberal leader, after they lost the Aston by-election in a once-in-a-century event, didn't even bother to tell his Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs or Shadow Attorney-General that he was abandoning the process even before the Parliamentary Committee had met. And they speak about dividing. They're managing to divide themselves. They had someone who was one of the architects of the wording, was the member for Bradfield, now sitting up the back. Andrew G. or Barara. Andrew G.
Members on
sitting
my
up
left.
the back as well.
Order.
Julian Leeser is someone who has more honour in his little finger than the front bench put combined. And the truth is that the process that occurred began in the lead-up to the 2007 election under John Howard, promised to advance constitutional recognition. We then had a process established in 2012. Tony Abbott established a process to take it forward for what the form of constitutional recognition would be. And that process led to the Constitutional Convention of First Nations people held at Uluru in 2017, where Indigenous Australians said they wanted something that wasn't just symbolic, they wanted something that would make a difference. And the way that you make a difference is by engaging people directly, by listening to those people who are impacted by decisions. And that is why a voice to Canberra is so different from what has happened over the previous 122 years, which is with the best of intentions. It has been a voice from Canberra, with the best of intentions, including from, and I pay tribute to the former Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Ken Wyatt, because what Ken Wyatt says is that with the best of intentions, we need to listen to First Nations people and we need a voice to Parliament, and to government, because that is how you get better outcomes. Because we know that is the case. Because if we look at the programs that are working the best, Indigenous Rangers, community health programs, justice reinvestment programs, they all have something in common. They are all something that have come from Indigenous people. They are all programs in which Indigenous Australians have been the architects of it. But those opposite, and particularly this leader of the opposition, seeks political advantage rather than trying to come together. Makarrata means a coming together after struggle. It's as simple as that, a process bringing people forward in the nature of reconciliation. And the fact that he's not prepared to front up at the Garma Festival this weekend, in order to explain his position. He'll be received politely if he attended. He would be, because one of the things about the Yotta Yindi Foundation and about that event is it's about respect. It's about bringing people together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia.
Order.
This is an opportunity to do just that, and that's why Australians will vote yes for the referendum when it's held in the last quarter of this year. They will vote yes, and they will advance reconciliation.
Concluded. Order. The question is the motion be agreed to. I'll put the question. All of those opinions say aye. Against no. I think the noes have it. Ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Round. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair and the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Gray and Parkes as tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Werriwa and Bean as tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 52, noes 90. The matter is resolved in the negative. Just ask members to return to their seats as quickly and as quietly as possible. Just checking. Order. If members can return to their seats as quickly and as quietly as possible. We'll move to the next question. Give the call to the member for McEwen.
My question is to the Minister for Government Services. What did the Royal Commission find were the real consequences of the robo-debt scheme?
Right. Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
I thank the member for McEwen for his question. On Monday, the member for Cook gave a speech exonerating himself as the real victim of the robo-debt scandal. The Leader of the Opposition has actually called it a strong defence. For the information of the Parliament, it was 2,114 words. Now, he did use 22 words to acknowledge the impact on individuals and families. He reserved the remaining 2,092 for himself. But I'm not going to focus on the fact that for every word he spent on a victim, he kept 100 for himself.
The member for Cook will cease interjecting.
The member for Cook, though, used a phrase. He regretted the unintended consequences. In fact, he used the word unintended consequences not once but 5 times. And the member for Cook is the master of the English language. See, unintended consequences has a clear implication. It was just an accident. Unintended. Too bad, so sad. It implies that the consequences of robo-debt could not have been predicted, could not have been foreseen. And in doing so, he attacks the whole Royal Commission's core findings. The Royal Commission showed that robo-debt, in its design, in its rollout, was indeed the consequences were completely foreseeable. The war on the poor that the Coalition launched during robo-debt was entirely predictable. Now, of course, the statement got even more interesting, and I had to watch the video twice.
The member for Cook will cease interjecting.
I had to watch the video twice because the member for Cook actually says, and I thought it was a misprint in the transcript, he says...
The member for Cook will cease interjecting.
He says, I stopped robo-debt. The sheer chutzpah, the trademark shamelessness, the man most known in Australia for the sprint to claim credit for everybody's actions, including the courage of the victims. But the Leader of the Opposition, more alarmingly, says that the member for Cook's slippery language, excusing himself, it was a strong defence. But what I have to say to the member for Cook is, how dare you take the credit for stopping robo-debt when you started robo-debt? How dare you minimise the courage of the victims? How dare you take the credit of the advocates and all those who spoke against it? But I say to the Coalition, the member for Cook leaves you in an untenable position. You broke the law and you hurt people. You broke the law and wasted taxpayers' money. And you broke the law and continue to defend the undefensible. You have a simple choice. Cut him loose. Cut him loose, or he will damage the whole Liberal herd. Cut him loose now, and the Leader of the Opposition must make that decision now or own robo-debt for as long as he's there.
Order. Give a call to the honourable member for Calare.
Assistant Treasurer, can you update our region on my calls for a parliamentary inquiry into what has been a cold-hearted and shocking response by insurers to the recent storm and flood disaster in the central west of New South Wales? And will you also support our region receiving the same levels of state and federal disaster assistance which other devastated areas have received and which is currently being denied to our residents, such as the home buyback scheme for Eugowra and Molong and the special disaster grants for farmers in the fire-hit Hill End district? The injustice of this is appalling.
Give the call to the Assistant Treasurer.
I'd like to thank the member for Calare for raising this matter in the Parliament, asking the Prime Minister a question about this about a month ago, and the Prime Minister and I have discussed it, and I can update the House that this morning I've tabled a motion in the House which will bring forward an inquiry into the insurance industry, specifically the impact of those floods in your electorate, together with the impact of the floods in the northern rivers of New South Wales. And I thank the member for Richmond for her engagement, and our Brisbane-based members, including the member for Moreton, for the representations he's made about the impact of those floods in south-east Queensland. When a disaster hits, it's an absolute tragedy. It's a financial tragedy, but it's also a social and an emotional tragedy. And The insurance policies that people take out to protect themselves against the impact of these tragedies are there to smooth the financial impact, and they should not be adding to the anxiety of the disaster because of the mismanagement of a claims process. The Prime Minister stated when he was asked this question a month ago that he expects insurance companies to act honestly and fairly with claimants. That is the expectation of the government. And I want to thank you, Member for Clare, for inviting me to your electorate. We had meetings with small businesses in Molong. I met with Kayleen and Sarah. I think they run the newsagent and the hairdresser in Molong, told their personal stories and the devastation wrought by the floods in that town. We went out to Eugowra and I was very moved. The first shop I walked into was the community centre. I met with Sharon and she told me with tears in her eyes that she'd lost her father in the flood that hit Eugowra. He was washed away, one of 2 lives lost in that town. I was incredibly moved by that. We met with Brian and Leslie, who are still waiting on having their claims to be fulfilled. I think it's the Fat Parcel, the restaurant, the pop-up restaurant in town. I guarantee it's not Heart Foundation recommended. But I took from that visit that the community had pulled together, but they needed more support and they needed the insurance claims honoured and honoured better. So the inquiry, and I thank you for the engagement, the inquiry will look into the impact of those floods in those regions. The claims management process, the readiness of insurers to deal with it, the affordability of insurance. You've raised with me the issue of contested hydrography reports, and that's something we should be looking at. We also want to look at mitigation and how households and communities and the government can improve its effort around mitigation as well. Unless we look at all of these issues, we won't be resolving the issues and the problems around insurance. So thank you.
The call to the member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Why is an Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders' voice critical to improve the health of the First Nation people? Thank you.
Yes. Give a call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Tangney for his question. As we've heard quite a lot this question time, later this year, Australians will get the chance to vote to change their constitution and recognise the place of First Nations Australians. More than 30 years after the High Court first swept aside that long-standing legal fiction that this was somehow vacant land when Europeans arrived. Mr. Speaker, they'll also get the chance to give shape to that recognition through a voice to Parliament, listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to achieve better outcomes. And I can't think of a more important area to start listening again to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people than in health, because, let's be honest, Speaker, with the best of intentions on both sides of Parliament, with substantial investment, the current approach simply isn't working. And in those few areas of health policy where it is working, it's simply not working fast enough. Year after year, this Parliament is confronted with the yawning gap in health outcomes reported in the Closing the Gap report, the yawning gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Now, some health challenges for Indigenous kids, for example, are essentially unknown to non-Indigenous Australia, like rheumatic heart disease, which was eradicated from developed countries 50 or 60 years ago, a disease of grinding poverty, likely never seen by doctors who are working today in our major cities, but a disease that sees rates in remote Aboriginal communities among the highest in the world, higher even than sub-Saharan Africa. These health gaps and so many more are riddled right through our system, and in some areas, frankly, they're getting worse. In the last decade, for example, cancer death rates across Australia plummeted by 10%, but for Indigenous Australians, they actually went up by 12%. The gap actually got bigger. Now, none of this is news to anyone in this Parliament, and all of us have worked hard over the years with the best of intentions to make a difference and to close the gap. But we need a new approach. Just like a good doctor listens to their patients, listening to the voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about the root causes of these endemic, yawning health gaps, listening about better, practical, more effective ways to make a real difference. That is the offer that's been made to the Australian people by Indigenous leaders in the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And that is the chance, Mr Speaker, to help Aboriginal Australians live longer, healthier and happier lives.
Call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Minister for Government Services and the NDIS. Has the Minister received any advice from any government agency that the NDIS has contracts with any person or entity with links to crime groups?
I just asked. I couldn't hear the full part of the question because there was interjections. I just asked the Minister, the Shadow Minister, to state the question again.
Has the Minister received any advice from any government agency that the NDIS has contracts with any person or entity with links to crime groups?
Crime groups. Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
I thank the member for his question, and I'll certainly go back and check any specific matters. But in terms of criminal activity and the NDIS, it's been Labor who's now turned the real focus on tackling it. The NDIS, when it works well, works tremendously well. And under Labor, it's here to stay. But we do want to make sure that every dollar gets through to the people for whom the scheme was designed. One of the issues and challenges with the scheme is that when there is government money, sometimes people, opportunists, criminals, others, become attracted to trying to siphon that money off for their own good rather than the best interests of participants. So I certainly had the view in opposition, and it's been confirmed in government, that there is an element in the Australian community who are basically taking money from participants, robbing people on the scheme, and sometimes not only in an unethical manner, but indeed in a criminal manner. It is the case, however, that under Labor we've had to invest in crime detection. It was Labor who set up what we call the Fraud Fusion Task Force in the October MyEFO budget of last year. What we've done is invested roughly $140 million, and that's allowed greater cooperation between the AFP, the Australian Tax Office, our own NDIA and the Quality and Safeguards Commission to start working together. I'm actually very pleased at the work of the Fraud Fusion Task Force, but I do have to say, for the record, it didn't exist before Labor got elected. I had the view in opposition, it's been confirmed in government, that under the coalition the back door of the scheme was open to rorts and shonks and cheats. And I'll give you one proof point of this. I just caution the coalition members before they sort of in a knee-jerk manner just respond to what I just said. In about 2021 there were 26 criminal investigations going on. Under Labor now there's 46. We put extra reason. Well, under the coalition, there was $115 million worth of payments being investigated. Now there's $400 million worth of payments being investigated. It's only under Labor that you can read in the Daily Telegraph that we're cracking down on our crime gangs in Western Sydney and elsewhere. So absolutely. There was one other issue of fraud which did come up, which we are investigating. It's dodgy contracts within the NDIA, which were done under the previous government. The member for Bruce talked about some of that. So we are certainly looking at that. And if the Manager of Office and Business can tell us where Mr John McGarrison is, that would be helpful in our inquiries. He was a Queensland LNP fundraiser. But let me reassure the opposition and Australians listening, under Labor we will make sure and do our very best that every dollar gets through to the people for whom the scheme was designed and the shonks can get off our scheme and we give them fair notice.
Give the call to the member for order. The House comes to order. I'll hear from the member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What steps has the Albanese Labor government taken to improve women's economic and financial security in Australia, and what impact is this having?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for her question. And indeed, under the former government, one of the groups that was left behind was Australia's women. Australia fell to 70th in the world for women's economic participation and opportunity. 70th in the world. We're the world's 12th largest economy. We have put economic opportunity for women at the heart of our agenda. And last week we learned that Australia has jumped some 17 places up on the World Economic Forum's gender equality ranking, from 43rd to 26th. More to do, but a direct result of the policies and programs that we have put in place. But of course those opposite are stuck in the past when it comes to policies for women, for Indigenous Australians, for an inclusive society. And in the lead-up to the 2007 election, the then acting Treasurer, the member for Dixon, when we said that we were going to have a maternity leave policy, he said this: Labor's policy will force up unemployment and drive employers away from employing women of childbearing age. Really? Not said in 1950, said in 2007 by the now Leader of the Opposition. He went on to say more. Labor's plan on maternity leave will do little more than hurt the employment prospects of women and cripple small business. It will backfire on women in particular, wreck small business and ultimately undermine the strength of the Australian economy. Just one of the scare campaigns that was out there, in this case a scare campaign against maternity leave. Well, under our government, gender pay gap has fallen to its lowest level on record. More women than ever before are in full-time work. We've established 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave. We've given a 15% pay rise for aged care workers, overwhelmingly women. We've got cheaper childcare. We've expanded paid parental leave, and we're implementing all 55 of the Respect at Work recommendations. And this week we passed the Strengthening the Safety Net bill that they threatened to oppose and block on Monday morning, but then by Monday lunchtime had changed their position. Well, that will expand single parenting payment for some 52,000 single mums. It will increase rental assistance. The majority of recipients are women. It will increase help for unemployed over 55, a majority of whom are women as well. Mr Speaker, we understand that one way in which you improve the economic performance of Australia is to be inclusive and make sure that all Australians, men and women, are able to contribute and able to benefit from a growing economy. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.